Vítám vás u dnešního dílu podcastu Insider. Moje jméno je Michal Půr a je tady se mnou můj kolega Tomáš Jirsa.
Dobrý den.
Ještě než začneme, tak pár obvyklých vzkazů od Tomáše.
Rádi bychom poděkovali našim partnerům, kterými jsou advokátní kancelář ROWAN LEGAL, provozovatel zdravotnických zařízení PENTA HOSPITALS a American Academy in Prague, mezinárodní základní a střední škola s moderním kampusem v Nuslích, inspirovaná nejlepšími vzdělávacími systémy na světě. Více se dozvíte na www.americanacademy.com.
Zároveň chceme poděkovat všem, kdo nás pravidelně poslouchají a podporují. Pokud chcete slyšet celý díl, předplaťte si ho pokud možno na Patreonu, patreon.com/Insider Podcast. Odkaz najdete v popisku pod videem a teď už jdeme na to.
So, welcome to the Insider Podcast. Today's episode will be very unusual. We have a foreign guest after a month, another Briton. I recently had a chance to speak to Bradley Wiggins 3-4 weeks ago. And our today's guest is Mark Galeotti. Welcome.
Good to be here.
He's expert on Russian internal politics and international politics as well. He's the director of consultancy Mayak Intelligence, honorary professor at the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies, author of over 20 books on Russian politics. One of them, Forged in War, is coming out now in Czech. And podcaster as well in Moscow's shadows. So welcome to Prague.
Oh, very good to be back.
It's been a long time.
Yeah, I mean, look, I travel back and forth to and from Prague occasionally anyway. But yes, I mean, from my time when I was actually living here, it's been about 5 years now.
Yeah. So I've always regarded you as somebody who is very deep into what's going on in Russia, going way beyond the common commentary seen from outside and speaking to a lot of people inside. Has that gotten a lot more difficult in the last years?
I mean,
keeping this real, inside.
It has got more difficult, though. In some ways, I'm lucky that I am so old and decrepit, in that I have been studying this for a long time, and therefore my contacts base were built up over the decades. I mean, I did my PhD when there was still a Soviet Union in 1988 to 1991. And so, yes, the war, and particularly from my point of view, I mean, I was in the first batch of British citizens who were banned indefinitely from Russia in June of 2022. And inevitably, that meant that I lost contacts. About 30% of my contacts probably don't want to talk to me anymore, which I can totally understand. After all, there's always a risk in talking to foreigners. But still, maybe it's a bit harder. Maybe with some of my contacts, I have to be a little bit more discreet and cautious, or we use, different, more secure apps to talk. So I can still talk to people. The big thing that I miss is the kind of random, accidental information you pick up when you're actually traveling there. I mean, the last time I was there was November of 2021. And firstly, I would usually try and travel outside Moscow, because Moscow is obviously where all the political action is at. But to try and think, well, Moscow is Russia is a little bit like living in New York and thinking you know America. And I try to travel, but also the conversations that you hear sitting in a bus or a metro train, or actually seeing what's on the shelves in a shop in a provincial town, all of that gives that extra texture of information. Yeah. So yes, there's a lot of media now. I can still talk to people, but it's not quite the same.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is at the moment the biggest gap, or where's the biggest gap of our perception of what is going on inside of Russia and reality?
Yeah, I think it's the question of what Russians feel, particularly about the war, but obviously everything really connects to the war these days. Because there are these opinion polls carried out by reputable bodies still, who show strong support for the war. But the point is we've fallen back into almost Soviet attitudes. It's terrifying actually how far old attitudes have returned, even amongst people who didn't actually have a memory of the Soviet Union. Of knowing what you're meant to say, of not feeling comfortable with being honest. So, these surveys all show strong support for the war. Other people have tried more clever, more indirect ways of trying to assess the sentiment, and it's clear there's actually much less enthusiasm for it. But generally speaking, when you're in a thuggish or authoritarian regime, you can't really speak openly, even though it's actually amazing how much is said on social media. So I think it's that question of quite what Russians feel. Now, on one level, maybe you could say it doesn't really matter, because Putin and his friends call the shots. But still, I think for our own understanding of Russia, that is, for me, still one of the most problematic areas.
One of the biggest things I learned from your books is the perception from outside being everything is ruled by Putin all the way down, as opposed to the reality when it's more of a, you call it a medieval court of thugs that influence all levels of power. So could you walk us through the actual setup at the moment of the major figures and what's their influence in the system?
Sure. I'm glad that this is a 4-hour podcast. Look, put very simply, to zoom out, first of all, Russia is, in the main, a modern, bureaucratic, institutionalized state like most states, Czech Republic, Britain, or whatever. There are ministries with their own responsibilities and all sorts of bodies, and people essentially doing their jobs. The difference is precisely, as you say, that there is this almost medieval court that sits on top of it, within which the real currency is Putin's favor. So everyone is constantly competing to please the boss and to tell him what he wants to hear, not what he needs to hear. And at that level, firstly, what your job is doesn't really matter. What your official job title is. Your job is to do whatever the boss wants you to do today, which may well be different tomorrow. That's why I've also called this an adhocracy, in which it's a sort of almost a kind of, again, everything is just determined on at the day, on the time. And the thing is that, whereas in the main, and yes, there is a lot of corruption and so forth, but nonetheless, essentially the bureaucratic machine is trying to do its job. But constantly it's getting political demands placed upon it, and politics always trumps professionalism in this system. So, you might have, let's say courts, within the courts, most court judgments are based around what the law says and what the facts and the evidence say. But when there's some political pressure, then at that point, the judge knows what judgment he or she is meant to give, or actually gets a phone call from someone higher up. So, politics can always reach in and basically distort anything. And at that medieval court, well, Putin has only a small handful of people that he really trusts and talks to. And these are his friends who are, generally speaking, not politicians. If anything, they're actually big businessmen, they're oligarchs. Let's be honest, if you've got Putin's favor, why go through all the hassle of actually having a real job where you're going to have to do real work? Why not just be obscenely rich with government contracts being poured into your corporation and such like? Now, that little circle is a real black box. These are people who don't generally give interviews. They don't express their views. They don't write articles. We don't know what they're telling Putin. We often have to sort of rely on secondhand, what is often little more than gossip. Then there are the people who are essentially the people who actually run the country for Putin. And all of these know that they're disposable. They're not his friends, they are his subordinates. And this is why they're constantly competing. And the cast of who's in, who's out, who's powerful and who isn't, it changes over time. Once upon a time, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was really quite a significant figure. Since the invasion of Crimea back in 2014, he has almost physically shrunk, and so now he's pretty much irrelevant. Nikolai Patrushev, who was Secretary of the Security Council, a deeply scary man, very much someone who believes in the most bizarre conspiracy theories about the West. He was, in effect, Putin's national security advisor. He was the man who painted a picture of the world for Putin. And yet, very recently, he was actually removed from that position. He's still a presidential aide. He still has access to Putin, but he's much, much less powerful. So this is it. Putin, if there's one thing he understands, it's divide and rule. So he's constantly playing people off against each other, constantly sort of creating a sense of chaos and uncertainty, elevating one person today and lowering them down tomorrow. So I think this is the sort of the environment in which decision-making works. And it's how Putin essentially maintains his power, by making sure that no one else can build a coherent power base and begin to challenge him.
In one of the interviews you gave, you put forward this idea that one of the motives in Putin's head for the war in Ukraine and its ending could be his potential retirement. Is that really something that could be his thinking of being, I don't know, worn out, of being the number one guy for so long?
I think the honest answer is not anymore. I think up to the actual invasion, that was, I think, a point of no return. Before that point, look, he seemed increasingly detached, increasingly, frankly, bored by most of the job. Because what really are the challenges facing the leader of Russia? If you take aside this terrible war, diversifying the economy away from oil and gas, addressing the pensions issue and the demographic crisis of there not being enough workers, all of these things, transport infrastructure, these are not the things that excite him, that interest him. He was clearly more and more sort of uncomfortable with the real job. And so, yes, there were these periodic thoughts that maybe he was toying with the idea of retirement. Now, the thing is, in a system like this, where there is no meaningful rule of law, at least not at the top, it's an incredibly dangerous thing to step down, because everything that you have and are, your security, your prosperity, it's all built on your position. And if you hand power to someone else, you are basically handing control of them to this successor. And you may think that they're the most loyal successor ever. They may even be it at that moment. What about next year? What about the year after? And interestingly, in January of 2022, we actually had a case in point in Kazakhstan, where again, you'd had this long-standing, essentially, dictator of Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev, who had picked a successor and essentially handed power to his successor while holding on to a position as head of the Security Council for life, just to keep a sort of foot in the door. And what happened in January is that protests were essentially manipulated by Tokayev, the successor, to basically get rid of Nazarbayev, force him to step down from his position. So that was actually a very last-minute reminder to Putin that, you may think you know a successor, but you might get that decision wrong. So I was wondering if one of the motivations behind his initial invasion, and remember, he didn't think this was going to be the start of a long, bloody war. He thought that Ukraine would just collapse just like that. And within a couple of weeks, he would have imposed a proxy ruler and brought Ukraine comprehensively back under Moscow's control. And I think he might have thought that would be the sort of crowning moment of his career. He would then join the ranks of the great state-building Russian heroes, the people he's always in his speeches comparing himself with, people like Peter the Great and the like. And at that point, he might be so well-respected that he could perhaps step down, again, find some honorific position, but essentially hand executive power to a chosen successor, because by that point, he'll be just sort of essentially bulletproof. Maybe. But now, I think that even if he did find a successor he could trust, and Putin's not a man who trusts easily, the temptation for that successor to in due course package Putin up and send him to a war crimes tribunal in The Hague for, I don't know, the lifting of Western sanctions or something. Even if no successor would actually think of that, Putin himself can't know that for sure. So frankly, I think he's now, not that we should feel any sympathy for him, but I think he's now stuck in that job really until death or infirmity take him out of it.
If you look at past 30 and more years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the perspective here in Central Eastern Europe and Western Europe being kind of, it's a little bit of this end of history, everything will be safe, Russia will eventually come to this democratic rule. what do you think were the key points where we misjudged what is happening and led to this situation of us being, I would say, extremely weak, and him using this chance to attack?
Well, in some ways, there's two tracks there. There's why Russia went Putinwards, and why the West turned out to be in such a weak position. I mean, to address the first one, without trying to say, oh, it's all the West's fault, I think we have to recognize that in hindsight, glorious hindsight, Western policy towards Russia in the 1990s was actually very foolish. Boris Yeltsin, the leader who'd taken power, he wasn't a Democrat, really. He certainly didn't have any kind of clear vision for what country he wanted to build. He was a great destroyer. When he had an enemy, he was focused and deadly, as Gorbachev found out. But once he'd won, he didn't really know what to do with power. But on the other hand, the people he was ranked against looked and were much more unpleasant from a Western perspective. So, to a degree, we were happy to turn a blind eye when democracy was distorted in Russia. 1993, Boris Yeltsin shells his own parliament in a constitutional dispute. According to the constitution, he was no longer president at that point, but that's all right. He rewrote the constitution afterwards to say it was okay, and we didn't have a problem with that. 1996, it looked like he was going to lose the election to the communists. And so what you had was, in effect, the election being rigged, thanks to the activity of a bunch of oligarchs who were involved in banking and the media. Well, we didn't want the communists to take power. So when Boris Yeltsin won the election, we said, good for you, Boris. And we then are surprised that Russians think that democracy is a sham, that it's always manipulated, that we don't really care about Russia, we just care about having sort of our guy in charge. In some ways, we contributed to the rise of not necessarily Putin specifically, but someone like Putin, a kind of revanchist nationalist who says, no, Russia's being taken for granted. We need to remind people that Russia has a place in the world. So that's that kind of one track. There's all sorts of other factors. And I'm not trying to say it's all the West's fault, but I think we have to recognize failures of Western policy. And in terms of the West, look, we got fat and lazy. We thought, yes, exactly, history is over, no more Cold War. We can take the peace dividend and scale down our armed forces. But not just that. I mean, that's part of it, but it's not just simply a question of how many tanks and planes and guns we've got. It's also about the fact that the European bloc and its view expressed through the European Union was essentially that Europe could just be this regulatory superpower, that as long as we're involved in trade and business, and as long as we're actually very effective in how we regulate that, that ensures our place in the world. Well, the trouble is, that's fine when times are good. But on the other hand, as we see, you can't regulate a tank division out of existence. When it comes down to it, we neglected the idea of geopolitics still matters. And we basically outsourced that to the United States. So it wasn't just security, it was just generally managing the geopolitical system. And the United States inevitably gets tired of it eventually. I mean, in this respect, Trump is obviously an extreme and bizarre expression of this, but in some ways, he's saying things that successive presidents have said. He's just doing something about it.
I just read a Barack Obama speech with one of the famous sentences like there was "I hate freeloaders," and being really basically a Trumpian speech, being focused on Europe.
Exactly, but I think we always thought, well, it won't really come to it or whatever. So I think Europe is basically going through a process of maturation, of growing up, of realizing that it actually exists in a world in which, yes, there is international law and such like, but there is also raw, rough geopolitics. And one way or the other, Europe has to work out how it's going to fit into that. Does it mean it becomes one single bloc with a single policy? I think Europe's a long way away from that still. But essentially, it has to accept that it operates in a tougher and more dangerous world than I think it really was willing to believe.
But do you think it's the reaction that we're seeing is sufficient? Because it's already more than 3 years of the war. We just recently visited with the podcast institutions in Brussels, and you hear people, diplomats, saying, we have a problem. We still cannot get banks to finance the defense industry, because of the ESG regulations. Mm-hmm. And so you have a 3-year-long war ongoing on the European continent, and still everything that is in the European political sphere seems very theoretical, very symbolic. Of course, there's some help happening, but it really seems that we have not. There's no awakening yet, the real one leading to action.
I think the problem is also in some ways that there is a gap between the rhetoric and the reality. We have so much sort of impassioned rhetoric about whether it's Ukraine, we're totally in support of Ukraine, whatever it takes for as long as it takes. And also Russia, that, Russia is an existential threat and we need to rearm and we need to be ready for potential war in 2 years. All kinds of things being said. No one actually truly believes that. Because when it comes to Ukraine, this is not an existential threat to the West. It is not as though Russia is going to be able to roll through Ukraine, let alone able or willing to then continue into Romania or whatever and into NATO territory. And ultimately, we have our interests, Ukraine has its. So yes, we support Ukraine, but not, for example, to the level where we're going to put our soldiers into risk or, huger amounts of money. So we shouldn't pretend otherwise. It just simply builds up fake expectations. And likewise, in terms of the military build-up, which is overdue and necessary. But nonetheless, if you genuinely think that there is a strong likelihood of a war with Russia within a couple of years, what are any countries doing messing around with 2.5% or even 3% of GDP on defense? They should be working out how they can spend 8%, 10%. But no one is. And the answer is because no one really thinks that it is a threat.
Děkujeme, že jste doposlouchali až sem. Pokud chcete slyšet víc, celý díl najdete na adrese patreon.com/Insider Podcast. Odkaz najdete v popisku hned pod videem.
A co jsme v dnešním Insideru řešili dále? Podívejte se.
I know there is a contingency war plan in Moscow for what happens if the Chinese invade. I suspect it's just a sheet of paper with the line, we go nuclear in 6 days. And every now and then they cross out 6 and put 5, and then they put 4. Because there's no way Russia can defend itself against China militarily. I was in the first batch of British citizens who were banned indefinitely from Russia. Putin, if there's one thing he understands, it's divide and rule. Mm-hmm. So he's constantly playing people off against each other, constantly creating a sense of chaos and uncertainty, elevating one person today and lowering them down tomorrow. In some ways, we contributed to the rise of not necessarily Putin specifically, but someone like Putin. But when he basically says that the international order is actually one that was created by the West in the interests of the West, he's right.
For me, personally, seeing Robert Fico in Moscow with President Putin, it was sad.
Their view was absolutely that eventually Russia's going to win this war. It's going to come out of this fine. Sanctions will largely be lifted. And from their point of view, Hungary will be well placed to take advantage of that.